I think that budgets are essential. I think they get a bad rap. But one thing that I have found is even when people say, like, oh, I teach you a no budget approach, we just do X, Y, and Z. It's still a budget. They're just calling it something different because I guess it feels better for
Hmm.
people. But the way that I think about budgeting is you are just making a plan for how you want to use your money on the front end versus looking at where it went on the back end, which is what we were doing. Like when we looked and it's like, oh, we only have this much left. Where did this money go? We didn't plan on the front end where we wanted it to go. And so creating a budget allows you to plan where you want your money to go. And that way you can make sure that you account for the needs, like the things that you have to pay, your food, your housing, your transportation, bills, etc. But then you can also make sure that you are setting aside money for things that you just want and for the financial goals that you have.
Are your finances out of control? Does your student loan debt seem insurmountable? Our guest today not only paid down hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt, she now helps other lawyers gain control of their finances as well. Welcome to the Lawyer Millionaire Podcast, a show focused on empowering law firm owners to create extraordinary wealth. I'm your host, Darren Wurz, financial planner for law firm owners. Our guest today is Rho Thomas, a financial counselor specializing in serving professionals in the legal field. As a former lawyer herself, she has a deep understanding of the financial complexities lawyers face. Rho is dedicated to educating and guiding her clients towards a successful financial future. And I can't wait to hear all your secrets to success, Rho. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Darren. How's it going?
It's going great. I'm excited that you're here. It's about time we had you on the podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And I know if people who are listening are dying to hear this incredible journey, you shout it loud and proud of how you overcame your student loan debt. It's an incredible story. And why don't you start there and tell us a little bit about your journey into financial counseling and how you overcame your student loan debt. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my journey started back when I had my first son, who is 7 now. My husband and I were both working full time. My husband is a physician. He was a resident at the time, and I was a junior associate in Big Law. And so when I had my first child, I was interested in dropping down to some sort of part-time, like the firm offered a situation where you could do a percentage of the billable hour requirement for that same percentage of your salary. So I was interested in doing that. But when we sat down and looked at our finances, that's when we realized exactly how much debt we had and just the state of everything. And so that prompted me to start learning about personal finance more. I had known some things because I had also before that had experiences with, getting my account down to $1, like just trying to manage my account by myself for the first time in college. I'm swiping, I was going to Chick-fil-A all the time, all of that. So I had learned enough to stop doing that, but I hadn't really learned about managing our finances as a whole beyond that. And so having my first son, not being able to take advantage of this policy like I wanted to, really prompted me to start learning more about how to manage my money. So I learned all about paying down debt. I learned about looking at the difference between like how much interest we were accruing on our debt versus how much interest we were paying or we were earning on, our retirement accounts, things like that. And so we started putting together all of these different pieces from different blog posts that I would read, books that I would read, podcasts that I'd listen to. And we came up with a system that worked for us that I think is really balanced, where it's not so focused on debt. Some people are like, oh, don't go to restaurants, don't go out to eat, don't go on vacation until you get all of this cleaned up. And then some other people are like, oh, well, just do what you want. It doesn't really matter, YOLO. So we found a system that allows us to balance where we can make the progress that we want it to make financially without completely sacrificing life.
Hmm, interesting. Is that where, is that an important place to get to? I mean, I feel like when you're so focused on paying down debt that you ignore, sacrifice so many things, it leads you to a place where you're like, oh, forget it, and you go back to spending. Have you seen that in people you've worked with, or is that a common thing people experience?
That's definitely a common thing when you are in this situation of depriving yourself, cutting everything, like just trying to buckle down, until you pay things off. I think we get to the point where you don't want to anymore. You get to
Mm.
the point that you get sick of it. It's kind of like I liken it to yo-yo dieting, where people cut out everything. I'm only going to eat kale and drink water so that I can get to this, weight. And then when you get there, you ultimately end up sabotaging yourself because then you go back to eating normally again, right? And
Mm.
all of the things that you were doing to get to that goal weren't sustainable. Or you don't get there because you're depriving yourself for so long and you just give up, like you said. And it's just
Mm.
like, all right, well, I'm just going to treat myself. And then you just kind of go overboard in the other direction because you've been so deprived for so long.
Yeah, there was an interesting phrase on your website I noticed when I was getting ready for this podcast. You said you felt like you were making a lot of money, but still feeling broke.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, we were in a situation where we were making money, but we were spending it all. And
Mm.
so we didn't see the money. I've heard a lot of people describe this experience of getting to the end of the tax year and getting your W-2, and it's like, oh, you've made this much. And it's like, where? Where is like that was exactly how I felt, right? Where it's like, okay, on paper, we've, made this amount of money, but it
Mm.
doesn't feel like we've made that amount of money. And when we sat down, like back when we were looking at our finances, trying to figure out how we could get to this place where we could take advantage of that part-time policy, and we looked at where all of our money was going, all of our dollars were being spent, we had like $100 left between how much we brought in and how much was going out.
Mm.
And that contributed to that feeling of it's like, oh, well, we're making all this money but we feel broke because there isn't a reason that we should have gotten to $100 left in our accounts. And it
Yeah.
wasn't $100 left in our accounts, but when we looked at the
Yeah.
income versus the expenses through the month, there should have been a larger gap than $100 there, right? And so
Yeah.
it was all because we weren't paying attention or being intentional with how we were using that money. For us, a lot of it was going to restaurants around. I'm in Atlanta. There's, a lot of new restaurants always popping up. So we would do that a lot. Maybe shopping, just different things where we weren't extravagant by any means, but we weren't being intentional. We weren't directing the money to where we wanted it to go. And ultimately, when we think about how we want to use our money, where we want it to go, we realized that a lot of it was going to things that we didn't care about as much as maybe other goals that we could have been putting it toward.
Mm. Hmm. What would you say to someone who is like, I don't want to look at the money? I know I'm spending a lot, but I don't really want to even take a look at it. What would you say to that person?
Well, I think ultimately, if you don't want to, you don't have to, right? Like nobody says
That's
that you
fair.
have to get on top of your finances or to achieve certain things with your finances. So I would encourage that person to determine what's really important to them. If it's important to you to pay off your debt or to invest or whatever it is to improve your financial situation in some way, then there is something that has to change there, right?
Mm.
And maybe you don't get to the point that you're micromanaging every single dollar, but you do want to have some sort of overview of this is how much I'm bringing in, this is how much I'm spending out. Do I like that or do I want to make some tweaks there?
Okay, that makes sense. Is it all about budgeting? Do I have to budget? And what is your unique approach to budgeting?
Yeah, so I think that budgets are essential. I think they get a bad rap. But one thing that I have found is even when people say, like, oh, I teach you a no budget approach, we just do X, Y, and Z. It's still a budget. They're just calling it something different because I guess it feels better for
Hmm.
people. But the way that I think about budgeting is you are just making a plan for how you want to use your money on the front end versus looking at where it went on the back end, which is what we were doing. Like when we looked and it's like, oh, we only have this much left. Where did this money go? we didn't plan on the front end where we wanted it to go. And so creating a budget allows you to plan where you want your money to go. And that way you can make sure that you account for the needs, like the things that you have to pay, your food, your housing, your transportation, bills, etc. But then you can also make sure that you are setting aside money for things that you just want and for the financial goals that you have.
Hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So, if you're going to create a budget, what are the steps you kind of start with, in sort of, putting that together for yourself? And how do you make sure you can stick to it?
So I would say the first step is to look at where your money is going now, because most times we don't know. Like we're just spending the money, we have no idea where it's going. So let's look at where your money is going. I have my clients do a look back of at least a month, but ideally the last 3 months, because I think if you can get data from a quarter, that gives you a really accurate snapshot, right? A lot of life happens in 3 months. So
Hmm.
1 month might be abnormally high because there was something going on. 1 month might be abnormally low, but over 3 months, you can get a really good picture of your typical spending. If you don't want to do 3 months, and candidly, most of my clients do not do the full 3 months, but at least a month gives you some data to work with. From there, you want to look at, do I like these numbers? Do I like where this money is going?
Mm.
Do I like how much I'm spending in X category? Should that be, lower or higher, whatever it is based on what's important to me? Another aspect is looking at the top maybe 5 things that are important to you in life, like not just in the context of where you're spending your money, but in life, right? What are these top 5 things that I value, that bring me joy, that are important? Because those things will be a filter for when you're looking at where you want this money to be going forward. So
Hmm.
then we're going to take this look back of where you've been spending your money, your thoughts about if you like those numbers, if you like where the money is going, coupled with the things that are important to you. And now we're going to adjust those numbers to create a budget that takes into account those things that are important to you, the goals that you have, all of that. But it's going to be realistic because it's based on your actual numbers, right? So we're not pulling random numbers out of thin air, like, oh, I should be able to spend $100 on groceries, but you typically spend six, right?
Hmm.
So when we make the budget from the realistic numbers of where you're actually spending and just adjust, then it's much more likely that you will stick to it because you're not setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, it's so critical to have an awareness of where your dollars are going. And so many of us don't know. And when I do retirement planning with folks, we're trying to figure out, okay, what's your retirement budget going to be like? And that informs how much you need to save. And when people estimate, it's always lower than reality. Like people come in and they're like, oh yeah, I can live on $3,000 a month. I only spend $100 a month on groceries. I'm like, yeah, right. Get out of here.
Exactly.
Yeah, and when you look at it over a longer time frame, you're right. It is so eye-opening, you know, and you don't realize it in the moment because things are just happening. And you look at your statement and you're like, wait a minute, I spent X number of thousands of dollars this month. How did that even happen? I think for me, and maybe you've had this experience, we just forget. We forget what we spent money on. We forget what we purchased.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And I think to your point about our estimates, like I think we have these ideas in our mind of like where it should be, or like these
Mm.
idealized ideas of where we think that we're spending our money. But one of the big ones for my clients tends to be eating out, restaurants, takeout, things like that.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, I probably spent a couple $100s, and it'll be like $500, $1,000, things like that. Like those little purchases add up over time,
Mhm.
and we don't realize it from day to day. But then when we're able to look back and look at it in the aggregate, then we can see like, oh, I'm spending a lot more in this category than I thought I was.
Yeah, and don't get me started on restaurants, especially lately. I mean, with inflation, I was at a restaurant the other day. It was like $29 for the salmon. I'm like, get out of here. There's no
Yeah.
way. Now, depending on where you're at, if it's really good salmon, maybe that's worth it. But I was like, this is crazy.
No, I was just talking with a couple. they were talking about, their daughter really likes, I don't remember which restaurant it is, but one of the like fast food, like burger chains.
Mm.
And they were saying how they remember, back in the day, you could get 3 meals and it'd be maybe $20. And now it's much more than that
Oh yeah.
because, as you said, inflation, right? Over time, these prices just keep going up. And we're thinking like, oh, I'm just going to run to, Burger King and get this thing. And it ends up being much more than you anticipated spending.
Yeah, don't get me started on fast food either because I feel like it's such a trap. I get like one thing and maybe a drink or something to go with, and before I know it, I've spent $15
Yep.
and it's just this small meal. By the time I finish it, I'm still hungry. I'm like, it doesn't make any sense. So, I got another interesting question I want to ask you. How do I, if I'm want to start this journey of budgeting and getting my finances together? How do I get my spouse or significant other on board with that process too? Do you have some insights for us there?
I definitely do. I will tell you, don't do what I did initially, which
Oh,
is just like, hey, I just heard this episode from this lady named Ro, and we just need to do A, B, and C. Like, let's do this. If we do these things, then we're going to be able to pay it off. I went in with this is what we do. We just do step one, step two, step three, and then we're going to be, we're going to be there. And my husband was like, that doesn't sound like anything that I want to do. He's like, everybody has student loans. Everybody has this. We've been in school for this long. I want to live, right?
hmm.
It wasn't until our son was born and we were looking at how we could possibly do this part-time policy where he, like, I think I was able to articulate why the things that I had learned about not overdrafting, like not getting my account down to $1, like those basic things that I had learned about finance, why I thought those things were so important and why the things like paying off debt were more important to me than just, oh, it's just a part of life. Everybody has student loans. And so the tips that I would have for anyone who's trying to get their spouse on board is to dream together and
Hmm.
think about what you want your future to look like, what that life looks like. And then from there, you can look at what things you need to put in place financially that help you get there or that move you toward that goal. Because when you've got that buy-in on the dream that you all have together, then your spouse will be much more likely to get on board with the tactical, like financial strategy things to get there.
Yeah, I love that. Having a sense of purpose is so critical behind doing these things. No one is inspired by, well, maybe some people are. I'm weird and I'm inspired by it, but very few people are inspired by just the idea of saving money, putting money, stashing money away, I'm the weird kid that when I got birthday money or Christmas money, I put it in my bank account. But yeah, you want to have that sense of purpose. That's really a key part of it. And another thing I wanted to ask you, related to that is let's talk about mindset. How important is mindset and attitude, and how does that correlate in with the work that you do with people and dealing with their money?
Yeah, I think mindset is key, right? I think there are people like you, like me, who are just interested in financial concepts, but everybody is not necessarily like that. And so, one of the things that I teach my clients is to think about what it is that they are already good at with their money, even if you don't feel like you're naturally good with money. And I don't know that I'm necessarily I would say that I was necessarily naturally good with money. I have become interested in money and have learned things over the years. But some people just aren't interested, as you just said, right? And some people have this idea that I'm just bad with money. I'm just a spender. I'll never be able to save. Like all of these really negative thoughts about themselves, about their ability to manage money. And so I think everybody is good with money in some way. And I always encourage my people to pick out the ways that they are good with money because often we just overlook them, right?
Mhm.
So looking at the fact that you paid your bills, right? If you paid your bills on time, that's good with money. We don't just discount that as, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do, because there are a lot of people who don't do that. So you
Yeah.
are doing something that's good with money, right? Like identifying, acknowledging the things that you're already doing, that are good with money because that helps you to shift that mindset to see the things that you're doing and it motivates you to keep going to do more things that are good with money. I think the way that you think about your money, it very much impacts the way that you approach your money. So if
Mm,
you're thinking about money as this negative thing, if you feel bad about yourself and your ability to manage money, you're much more likely to avoid it versus when you're able to highlight the good things that you do, to think about it a little bit differently, you'll be more likely to do the things that you want to do to improve your finances and not feel like it's something to run away from.
yeah. You have to celebrate those little victories. And even when the progress is small, it's important. In having conversations with people about starting to save and put money towards goals, um, a lot of times people are scared that they have to take this big jump. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to save $1,000 a month. Where's it gonna come from? And so sometimes I'll encourage people, well, maybe that's where we want to get to, but maybe we can start small, start somewhere and start creating that habit and working that up over time. And then, give yourself a pat on the back.
Yes, no, I 100% agree with that. And if we can go back to my story, I didn't share how much debt that we had, but when we started, we had $670,000 of debt, and the majority of that was student loans. But to your point, that was, I think it was 16 different loans, 17 different loans, something like that. The smallest one was like $1,500. So
Mm,
yeah, we've got this huge mountain, of debt that feels overwhelming. It feels insurmountable, but I can do 1,500, right? I
mhm.
can I can do something with that. And so that's how we tackled our debt. We used that debt snowball method of paying the smallest balances to the largest balances. And we got a lot of quick wins because early on, it was those smaller loans, right? 1,500, 2,000, 3,000, et cetera. So at one point, we were paying off our loans like every other month or something like that, where it's like we're getting these paid in full letters. And that was really motivating. It's like, oh, wow,
Yeah.
we can do this. The biggest one was my husband's student loan. That was like 300 something thousand. It was like 350.
Mm,
And so by the time we got there, it was like we had paid off all these other loans. And so it's like, okay, this one's going to take a little longer, right?
yeah.
It's going to take us a little bit more time to pay off the 350,000 versus 1,500. But we felt like we could do it because we had all of those little wins along the way and we celebrated those things, like you said, giving ourselves the pat on the back and, wow, look at this. We even had a spreadsheet where we laid out all of the details of all of our debt. And as we paid one off, we would highlight it in green. And so over time, we're watching the green start filling up the page. It's like,
Mm,
okay, let's go. Let's get some more green on here? So little things like that that you can do, finding those small wins along the way to the bigger goal that you have always is going to motivate you to keep going.
yeah, absolutely. So you used the debt snowball method and that worked well for you. Are there some other tips or tricks that you used in that process of tackling those loans?
Yeah, I think the debt snowball was definitely the biggest one, right? Being able
Okay.
to see those quick wins along the way. I think also the celebrating, as you mentioned. So as we paid off a loan, we celebrated it. Another thing, and I don't know that it's necessarily like a trick per se, but it goes back to the mindset piece and the way that you're thinking about things. So when we're looking at if we wanted to spend on something or if we wanted to buy this thing, we would think about, is this more important to us than this goal of paying off this debt?
Hmm.
And being able to frame things that way, we made some different spending decisions sometimes. Now, that's not to say that the thing always has to be not as important as your goal. Like sometimes, yes, it is more important to me to go to this concert or to buy this thing or whatever it is, and that's okay. But being able to frame it as an intentional decision of I'm making a value decision here. Do I value this item more, or do I value, paying off this debt or saving or whatever the goal is? I think when we can look at that decision and make it intentionally, we make better decisions along the way.
Yeah. Tell us about what did it feel like to make that final student loan payment?
Funny enough, it did not feel as exciting as I had expected it to feel over time. And
Hmm.
I think part of that was that I had kind of settled into the mindset that we were going to do it, right? Like there was a time early on, like when we first added everything up and I saw that huge number, it was a gut punch and it
Hmm.
felt like we were never going to get there. And I remember beating myself up a lot, thinking about how, we both were educated, how did we get in this position, all of that. But over time, I learned not to look at my debt as some sort of negative reflection on myself. And I learned to stop hyper focusing on it and just to live life along the way, right? Like I told
Yeah.
you, we kind of settled into that strategy where we were balancing life and paying off our debt and achieving our other goals. And so I knew that we would get there. I was excited to do it. Don't get me wrong. It did feel like a relief when we made that final payment, but I expected it to be like, you see people dancing and
Yeah.
did you ever see that video, the guy that made the like I finished paying Sally Mae back or something like that?
I think I vaguely remember
Yeah, it's like
that.
years ago. Like
Yeah.
I expected it to be that where I'm gonna like put this song on and be dancing and like it just wasn't that. But it did feel really good because it's something we had been working toward for years.
Yeah. It's kind of like you already, in your mind, your debts were already paid off because you were already on that journey. So when it happened, it was like, okay, well, we were already expecting this.
Exactly. Exactly. Like we were in that mindset of it's going to be done. We just keep following this path and we are going to get there. And then, of course, we could see as the debt was getting smaller and smaller, it's like, oh, yeah, it's going to happen by, X month.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned something in there that's critical, not letting it be such a scary thing, right? It's there, it is what it is, and I'm making progress. It's not killing me, right? It's like
Yeah.
as long as I'm, chugging along, then it's okay. I'm okay, right? Is that a good way to
Yeah.
think about it?
No, exactly. And, I talk a lot about how I don't like the good debt, bad debt dichotomy. And I
Mm,
think a lot of times we get sucked into that, we internalize that. And it's like, oh, I have debt, and it becomes this heavy thing because we believe in good debt versus bad debt. And I think ultimately debt just is, it's not good, it's not bad, it just is what it is. And we put our perception on it by the way that we think about it, right? Coming back to that mindset piece. And so when we stop thinking about it as this negative thing that's holding us back, that's whatever, when it can just be there and we can have our plan, we can have our strategy to pay it off, then it doesn't feel so heavy. It doesn't feel so bad. Your debt does not mean anything about you as a person.
mm.
And regardless of somebody's made up rules about this type of debt is good and this type of debt is bad and whatever else, it doesn't have to be that. We get to decide how we feel about how we think about our debt and our finances as a whole.
Yeah, great insights. When we were talking earlier about enjoying things at the same time, is there a balance, or how did you strike a balance between saving and investing and paying off debt?
So the way that we approached it was kind of in chunks, if you will. So we had the goal of saving. We wanted to at least have an emergency fund. And I will tell you that we were a bit more risky than some might be. Like, the typical advice is 3 to 6 months of expenses. We decided to only save 1 month of expenses. And the reason that we did that was when we started getting really intentional about the plan, creating the budget, as we talked about on the front end, we had a lot of money available for the financial goals that we had. And so we saved a month's worth of expenses that was just there ready to go. And then we started putting the rest of that money toward paying off debt. The idea being, if we get into a situation where, there's something that comes up, we could just make a lower debt payment or not make a debt payment that month and use that cash flow to cover the situation. So that's how we did that. When things happened with the pandemic where, firms were furloughing and laying people off and things like that, we were like, okay, let's pause the debt payments for a little bit. Let's build up a little bit more of a reserve. But the way that we managed it was, saving, We're going to save, a month's worth of expenses, have that there, and then we just focused everything else on paying off debt. I am not saying that that is the strategy that everybody should take. I believe very much in everyone creating whatever plan works best for them because I think personal finance is personal. And
Hmm.
so, a lot of my clients are like, definitely don't want to do something like that. They want more of the like 3 to 6 months of expenses, which I think is perfectly fine. One
Yeah.
thing that I will say on that front is I think a lot of times people think 3 to 6 months of expenses and they're trying to do like 3 to 6 months of their income,
Hmm.
but it's like 3 to 6 months of expenses, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be all of your expenses. I like to look at what I call your bare bones expenses,
Yeah.
which is like, okay, these are the things that must be covered in case of an emergency. Let's do 3 times that or 6 times that.
Yeah, your core expenses you can't give up, and that's a great insight. I think if you're looking at 6 months of expenses and you're at zero and trying to build that up, that can be really daunting.
Exactly. Exactly. But if we're
So
just thinking about an emergent situation, let's look at what needs to be covered in that situation and then make sure we've got that.
yeah, absolutely. Well, Ro, we've flown through the time here, and you've given us some great advice and practical tips that folks can use and think about in terms of improving their debts and getting their finances organized. I've got another question for you before we go, and that is, what is your millionaire mission? And what I mean by that is, what's your big driving purpose that you're aiming for?
So, my millionaire mission is to help lawyers have more freedom, more flexibility, more control in their lives. That was what drove me to start getting on top of my finances in a more serious way after I felt constrained by my finances having my first child. And I realized that a lot of other lawyers were in similar positions. Maybe it wasn't exactly having a child and wanting to go part-time, but I found that a number of lawyers want to do other things sometimes and feel like they can't because of their finances. So I want to help lawyers manage their money better and achieve that freedom and control that comes with having that control of their money, of having the money available and being on top of their finances.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, if our audience wants to get in touch with you and learn more about you, where should they go?
They can find me on my website at rhothomas.com, and Rho is spelled RHO, or you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. And thank you, the listener, for joining us as well on this insightful episode of the Lawyer Millionaire Podcast. Hopefully, you've gained some great insights that can help you in your budgeting and managing your student loans and getting closer to financial freedom. If you enjoyed these conversations today, please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to, we would love it if you would leave us a review. Also, don't forget to visit our website at thelawyermillionaire.com. You'll find a wealth of resources designed to help you confidently navigate your financial journey. Stay safe, take charge of your future, and know that you're not alone in the road to success. I'm your host, Darren Wurz, and I'll see you next time.